attention to Tertullian specifically. And in this lecture, we're going to introduce Tertullian the man. Who was Tertullian? What's his general context, his general background? We'll introduce him in this lecture, and in the next two lectures, we'll talk more about his theology and his apologetics. So Tertullian lived from around 145 or 150 to 220, and we don't really know the date of his birth. These are approximations, but we're fairly certain on the date of his death. And here's a picture I found of Tertullian. We were talking during the break about the pictures you find online. You never know. Someone imagines what Tertullian would have looked like. Maybe he looked like this. Okay, biography. Let's talk about Tertullian's biography. He is from Carthage. So this course is focusing on Carthage and its vicinity. Tertullian is from Carthage. He is a true Carthaginian. Now, he's not born into a Christian family. He's not raised in the context of Christianity. He's living in a period when Christianity is not yet legal. It's not constantly suppressed, but if he's born in the middle of the 2nd century, then the Silletan martyrs, for example, let's just go back and look at his dates. The Silletan martyrs are killed when he's around 30 years old. So if Tertullian is from Carthage, there's good reason to think he's aware of Christianity. And he's aware of what can happen to Christians. Because the Christians, the Silletan martyrs, were brought to Carthage in 180 when they were killed, so he probably knows what's going on. Tradition says that he may have been a lawyer. And this comes from Eusebius of Caesarea, the church historian, who's writing in the early 4th century, who says that Tertullian was a man who was skilled in Roman law. That's a good indication that he probably was a lawyer by trade, which means that seems to be what he does early on in his life. His first job is a lawyer. And in our country, there's a joke about lawyers and tax collectors are the two groups that you think can never be a Christian. So against all hope and against all expectations, this lawyer becomes a Christian. Tertullian becomes a Christian. Now Tertullian, if you notice, we call him Tertullian, and we stop there, which is different from, let's say, Cyprian. We say Cyprian of Carthage, or Augustine of Hippo, or Clement of Alexandria. When we say of and then the place, we typically reserve that for bishops. So we usually don't call him Tertullian of Carthage because he was never the bishop of Carthage. We say Cyprian of Carthage. We say Athanasius of Alexandria. So when you're reading literature about early Christianity and these figures, if you see just a name, Tertullian, or Minucius Felix, or Justin, without a city attached to it, it usually means that person was not a bishop. If we add the name of the city onto it, it usually means they were a bishop. So he's Tertullian. Now, he may have been a priest at some point. We don't know this for sure. This is speculation. Was he ever a priest? Was he just a very, very educated layperson, or at some point did Tertullian become a priest? And was he ever in Rome? Here again, we're speculating. Little clues in some of Tertullian's writings that people have picked up on to indicate perhaps he was in Rome at some point. And one of the clues is that at points in his writing, Tertullian is very critical of Rome. Does this come from his firsthand experience in Rome, from his firsthand knowledge of Rome? Can he speak as directly as he does about the way Rome thinks about things because he was actually in Rome, and maybe he actually experienced the Roman life and the Roman setting? These are guesses and speculations. We don't know for sure. Unfortunately, Tertullian never tells us a lot about this element of his autobiography. He seems to convert in midlife, so maybe he has a midlife crisis, but around the age of 45 or 50, Tertullian converts to Christianity. And if he had a midlife crisis, then this was a good midlife crisis for him. Instead of going out and buying a sports car or going out and finding a younger wife, he converted to Christianity. And then he actually got married shortly after that. If you know a bit about Tertullian, you know that later in his life, he seems to be a bit conflicted on marriage, whether it's a good thing or not. But he's married. Not long after he becomes a Christian, he marries. So the idea that he came to Rome is linked with another idea, that maybe he left Rome because of the position the Roman Church had taken on the Montanists. We talked about the Montanists in a previous lecture. The Montanists, these are a group that comes from Western Asia Minor, Western Turkey, but they quickly expands, and we have Montanists in Rome, Montanists seemingly in North Africa, and we talked about whether the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicity might be a text that is a Montanist text. The Montanists are all over the place. In Rome, the Montanists were not accepted. Was Tertullian in Rome when this decision was made? And was he so upset and offended by what happened that he went back to North Africa? This is a guess. We don't know for sure. He doesn't tell us this. But historians are trying to connect the dots and fill in some of the gaps to see if this might be the reason that he comes back to Africa. Now, of course, this begs the question, was Tertullian a Montanist? This is one of the big questions about Tertullian. Was he a Montanist, or was he favorable toward the Montanist, and what does that mean, even if he was? So let's talk for a few minutes about the question of Tertullian as a Montanist or not. What are some of the indications that Tertullian might have been a Montanist, or at least might have been favorable toward the Montanists? One of these is that Tertullian states explicitly that he thinks the church is too easy on certain issues. For example, issues like remarriage. He thinks the church is too soft on these issues. In Rome, there are decisions made where people who have committed adultery can be forgiven. Tertullian thinks this is too soft. It's not rigorous enough. And the Montanists, as we talked about before, were very dedicated to a more rigorous asceticism, a stricter way of life. And perhaps Tertullian, if he was a Montanist, or at least he shared these concerns. So forgiveness in general. Tertullian was quite rigorous on forgiveness. Was he a Montanist? And the response to persecution. Tertullian writes about persecution. One of his criticisms of other Christians is that they are too soft on persecution and martyrdom. They don't show enough strength. They don't show enough courage. And one of the elements of Montanism that we talked about before was an emphasis on martyrdom. Well, Tertullian seems to have this similar emphasis. Is that because he was a Montanist? Or is it just because he shared that same idea? What we'll see later as we get into talking about Cyprian is that on many issues, if there is a more lenient position or a more rigorous, strict position, the African church in general will lean toward the rigorous, strict position on different issues. We're going to talk about the issue of the lapsed, what happens to people who give up their faith or who deny their faith, what happens with baptism. We'll see that the African church in general tends to favor a more rigorous, strict evaluation or interpretation. That's also going to be part of the Donatist controversy. So is Tertullian, does he have these characteristics because he's a Montanist or because he's a North African Christian and this is typical of North African Christians? We also know that he defended the Montanists like Irenaeus of Lyon. Irenaeus, the bishop of Lyon in southern France. And Irenaeus actually was one of Tertullian's heroes, as far as we can tell. Tertullian used Irenaeus, he used his works. We know that he knew his works because he uses his works in some of his own writing.
Irenaeus of
Lyon. Lyon, yes. So Irenaeus defended the Montanists. He defended the orthodoxy of the Montanists. Tertullian seems to have done the same thing. And in general, Tertullian seems very favorable toward this charismatic renewal movement. The Spirit, the very lively working of the Spirit through prophecies and visions. This was an emphasis among the Montanists. The Montanists, we could interpret it, the Montanists felt like the church needed more of the Holy Spirit, needed to be less stable, perhaps less organized. Not less organized, but needed more of the Spirit, needed more of new things to come in, the constant inflow of the Holy Spirit. Tertullian seems to share this general perspective. Is it because he was a Montanist? Or is it because he was just a more charismatic type of Christian? In Christianity today, as you certainly know, there's quite a range of different churches. And I've actually heard people refer to certain charismatic movements as Montanism, the new Montanism. And when they say that, they typically mean Montanism as a heresy. So there are some very charismatic denominations in different parts of the world, and some who are less charismatic look at them and say, look, this is too much. They're over the top. They've lost control. They're like the new Montanists. In the same way that some people are called Gnostics now. The new Gnostics, people who depend maybe less on their faith and more on some kind of secret knowledge that they claim to have. Okay. Another issue related to Tertullian and his Montanism or not is his emphasis on the new prophecy. His emphasis on the new prophecy, on the very lively work of the Holy Spirit, and the possibility that this work on the Holy Spirit or his belief in the Holy Spirit directly influenced his theology in a very specific way, leading Tertullian to be the first person to state explicitly the Holy Spirit is God. Tertullian states this. In a future lecture, we'll talk about him as a theologian. We'll see where he states this, the full divinity of the Holy Spirit. And he's writing, he dies in 220. He's probably writing around the year 200. And if you think about church history, the first Council of Nicaea in 325, if you look at the Creed of Nicaea does not say explicitly that the Holy Spirit is God. It says the Spirit proceeds from the Father, but it doesn't explicitly say the Holy Spirit is God. In 381, the Second Council, Ecumenical Council at Nicaea, one of the leaders, Gregory, actually resigns as leader of the council because he wants the creed to state explicitly the Holy Spirit is God. And in 381, if you look at the 381 creed, it also does not explicitly say the Holy Spirit is God. And Gregory said, we need to state this. And because the other bishops refused to state that explicitly, he resigned from the council. Now, as Christians, we read, we understand, we recite the Nicene Creed, we think of the Holy Spirit as being fully divine. But even in 381, at the council, there's some hesitation about saying that. Around the year 200, Tertullian is already saying it explicitly. So when we think about Tertullian and his role in theology, this is one of those places where he's ahead of his time in some ways. And he may have made some people uncomfortable in this way. But is his theology of the full divinity of the Spirit, is it inspired by this new prophecy movement, by the emphasis on the Holy Spirit, or not? We don't know. We're just, again, trying to connect the dots. Yes, a question?
Was he before Didymus the Blind?
Was he before?
Didymus the Blind?
Was he before Didymus the Blind? Yes, he's before Didymus the Blind.
Didymus also wrote about the divinity.
Yes, Didymus also writes about the divinity of the Spirit. Yes, Tertullian is before Didymus the Blind as well. Yeah.
At the same time, his rule of faith, he doesn't see Jesus as entirely on the same level as God, does he?
So the question's about his rule of faith. Does he see Jesus on the same level as God? Well, we'll come back to this a little bit with Augustine, and I think Augustine is perhaps influenced by Tertullian. In the West, what you end up with, at least, with the Trinity, is a hierarchical model,
Right.
which is different from the Eastern model. The Eastern model we generally describe as a community model. But in the West, you have a hierarchical model set up. And this relates to the creed and to what happens with debates over the language of the creed. So Augustine may be getting some of that from Tertullian.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
does that put him, is he almost putting the Spirit above the importance of Jesus?
Is he almost putting the Spirit above the importance of Jesus?
And is that an indication of the influence of
Yes. Is that an indication of the influence of this issue? That's a good question. I would, when we read against Praxeas, that may be something we can look at to see how he exactly parses out the relationship between the Father and the Son. We'll talk a little bit about that. I think there are indications that I think he still has them at least equal, or he talks about procession language and a kind of hierarchy. And in some ways, we'll talk about this in a future lesson, I'm going to suggest Tertullian may be responsible for the later debate within Christianity in the Creed, when we say the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, and then in the West was added and from the Son. I'm going to suggest that that language may actually come from Tertullian. In fact, I think there's good reason to think that language comes from Tertullian. Okay, another indication or question about his Montanism or not. Cyprian refers to him in a positive way, often in a positive way. So about 50 years, or 30 to 50 years after the death of Tertullian, or I guess 30 years after his death, 50 years after his primary period of writing, Cyprian seems to hold him in a positive light, but Augustine does not. Augustine seems to think that he joined a heretical movement, the heretical Montanist movement. And Augustine has questions about the orthodoxy of Tertullian. So was he a Montanist or not? If Cyprian thinks he was a Montanist, then Cyprian seemed to think that was okay. Seemed to think perhaps it was a particular variety of Christianity, but it wasn't a heresy. Augustine seems to think he had joined something that was at least a schismatic movement, if not a heretical movement. And we talked in a previous lecture about the possible connection to the martyrdom of Perpetua. This is one of the elements of this whole conversation. Did he actually edit the martyrdom of Perpetua? Is he the one who writes the introduction? The introduction that talks about the new prophecies and the new visions that the Spirit is sending to the church. If he was a Montanist in North Africa, did that make him a schismatic? Did that make him a heretic? Did that make him normal? Were there elements of Montanism that would have appealed to the sensibilities of the North African church? These are all the kinds of questions that scholars debate. Now, speaking personally, I don't know if Tertullian converted to Montanism or not. I don't know if I would even say that there's something called converting to Montanism. I'm a person who feels like God understands that there are different kinds of people in the world, and that God might reach out to different people in different ways, and that some people, their hearts are touched by a more traditional liturgical setting, where the liturgy and the richness and the history of the liturgy is what draws them to faith. And other people may be drawn to faith or drawn to Christ through a more charismatic, expressive form of worship. And can we give room for God to operate in different ways in different settings? And is that what Montanism is? If it's true, like the opponent said, if it's true that the Montanists thought they were actually the Holy Spirit, then we have a problem. But it's not clear if they necessarily thought that. And to some extent, scholars, the debates over Tertullian, was he a Montanist or not, was he this? This mirrors some of our own conversations, I think, in the modern church about other denominations. We're trying so closely to find out where the walls are between people. We spend a lot of time figuring out where the walls are, and maybe where the door of heaven opens and closes. And at times I wonder if God is up there in heaven saying, don't you have anything better to do? Don't you have anything better to do? Maybe stop thinking like theologians who are trying to parse out who's in and who's out, and maybe become an apologist for a while and reach out to the world. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't be discerning. I'm not saying we shouldn't ask questions. And I'm not saying that if we see something theologically that seems potentially problematic, I'm not saying we ignore that. But at times I think authors like Augustine spend a little too much time trying to figure out who's in and who's out. And that makes me, speaking personally, a little bit uncomfortable. So, questions about Tertullian the man before we turn to some of his works. Yes?
There is nothing in his works that he admits to be a Montanist.
Is there anything in his works where he admits to being a Montanist? There's nowhere that he says, I'm a Montanist. Now, when we talked about Montanism, we mentioned that the term Montanist is a term given to them by their opponents. They're the followers of Montanus. They call themselves the New Prophecy. So if he is the editor, if we knew for sure he had edited the Martyrdom of Perpetua, if we knew that he had written the introduction, in which it says new prophecies, that might be what we might call an admission that I'm a Montanist, possibly. But he would not have called himself a Montanist. If he was a Montanist, he would not have called himself a Montanist because that was a slur. That would have been a slur against his own group. So this is the importance of this possible connection.
So from where comes the idea of dividing his works before being a Montanist and after, according to what?
Yeah, so where does the idea come about dividing up his works in the pre-Montanist period and the after-Montanist period? And this is the tricky thing. The dating of all of Tertullian's works is very complicated and very debated. One of the tipping points in the literature that I've read is when Tertullian specifically begins criticizing the church in Rome. This seems to be one of the elements that, from some perspectives, Tertullian is leaving the church, is sometimes the language that you'll see. He's leaving the church. He's fallen out of favor with Mother Church, which, from that perspective of these authors, means the Roman Church. So these are the kinds of elements. And then when he begins to speak in more rigorous ways about things, about Christian practice, he doesn't become more liberal in his old age. He seems to get more strict on some things. It's little things like that. It's very difficult to say, this is the pre-Montanist period, and now on this date, here's his Montanist period. Yes?
I did a timeline on him, and the bit of information which we have here, which I didn't have there, was the possibility that he went back to Africa from Rome when the Bishop of Rome rejected Montanism. Because that in fact establishes Montanism as an issue throughout his life. Whereas to a reader like me coming to it fresh, it looked as if there were these compartmental periods in his life when he converted. So it seems as if it was an issue for him throughout his Christian life.
Yeah, so the comment is from a student who's done work writing a timeline of Tertullian's life, and noting that the possibility Tertullian left Rome because of the response to Montanism may suggest that the Montanist issue was an issue throughout his entire Christian life. I think this is very possible. When he converts, if he converts in 185, if he's in North Africa, he knows about some things that are going on there. Let's put it this way. In 202, I think we should assume Tertullian, I think there's good reason to think he's in Africa. Tertullian may know firsthand the Perpetua story. So he knows very well, and if this is a new prophecy or new visions kind of movement, he would know that very well. So yes, I do think it's not as if one day suddenly Montanism is an issue for him. If he's a Christian in Rome or North Africa, he certainly knows about Montanism right away. Whether it's a good thing or whether it's a watch out for this heresy down the street kind of thing.
The second question is, he obviously has a classical education. He possibly has a legal background, but he writes in Latin.
Yes.
Is that's fairly original, is it not?
So Tertullian has training, right? He has an education, he has possibly a legal background, but he writes in Latin. And what's the importance of his writing in Latin? He certainly knows Latin and Greek. Irenaeus is in southern France, but he's writing in Greek. And this is not uncommon, actually, in the Western world. We're going to see Tertullian's the first theologian to write in Latin. So even in Rome, people are writing in Greek. So there's something very important about his choice of Latin. And I'm just going to speculate. I don't know. I'm just going to speculate. If Tertullian is thinking about his audience, and if his audience is primarily Africans, not many of them are going to read Greek. If his audience is educated Romans, he could write in Greek. Because educated Romans in this period were writing in Greek, they're reading in Greek. The liturgy in the Roman Church is in Greek until the middle of the 4th century, until the 350s or 360s. So this suggests to me that his audience, he's really thinking about North Africans. who are going to be Latin speakers. If anything, they're going to speak Latin. If they're going to speak one of the classical languages, it's going to be Latin. They probably also speak a local dialect, but educated people are going to know Latin. And perhaps that tells us a little bit about his sense of local identity as well. Like, I'm an African writing for other Africans, and it's his conversation partners are his local partners. If Tertullian is trying to write for Rome and Antioch and Alexandria, he would have written in Greek, but he didn't. So I think his focus is Africa and then also Rome. He has things to say to Rome, and everyone in Rome also would read Latin.